So it's such a pleasure to be here with you today, to have the opportunity to speak with you. So I spend most of my time working with senior leaders across the public and the private sector, helping them gain clarity around what their purpose is, what being the best version of them looks like. I work with everyone from Fortune 100s like Google through to core government like the Treasury. And I love what I do. And the reason I love what I do is that I feel it has purpose for me, that it's important, that it's doing what matters. And my life's pretty good, in fairness. You know, I do have challenges, actually. I shouldn't really use my time to sort of use emotional support from you, but I will. Yesterday I was travelling and my coffee was a bit hot in the Koru Club, so just give me a moment. But more seriously, my life hasn't always been a life of purpose. My life hasn't always been a life of clarity around what my values are, what's important for me, what doing what matters looks like. So when I was 18, I was addicted to drugs, I was a high school dropout, I was associating with people who didn't care about my well-being or that of others, and in doing so I was choosing to put myself into high-risk situations. Now when I think about what the draw of drugs was for me, I think one of the main reasons is that I grew up getting some pretty standard Kiwi messages around, you know, take a concrete pill and harden up, and what emotions I was and wasn't supposed to feel as a man. And when I found myself feeling those emotions, when I found myself feeling emotions that made me feel weak and vulnerable and scared, I thought there was something wrong with me. And I certainly didn't have the skill set to deal with them. And as a consequence of that, I ended up seeking solace in drug use. And I came from a background where there were 4 of us boys, and we all grew up thinking that at 18 we would join the infantry, and if we were really living the dream in a couple of years you might get into the special forces. And our dad, and I'll talk more about Dad a little bit later, you know, he's an awesome guy, but he's very much a man of his generation. So he's in his 80s now, and he grew up as a boy during World War II in London during the Blitz. So he spent his nights in bomb shelters, living on rations, a pretty sort of tough existence. And like many men of his generation, he's not big on the unsolicited cuddles and I love you sons and all of that sort of stuff. In fact, you know, the way to his heart still to this day is manual labour. You chop firewood for him. That's how you show him you love him. He doesn't want any of this sort of soft stuff. He doesn't want cards or anything like that. He wants manual labour. But anyway, in this environment, my mum was the source of emotional support and softness. And I think that's the case for a lot of us. There'll be one parent who's sort of more your go-to from an emotional perspective. My poor mum, you know, she was such a lovely, gentle woman, but the most common thing she probably used to say to us boys was, "Go outside if you want to fight." And when I was 18, she was in the process of dying, and I really wasn't coping with it. You know, it made me feel all these emotions I thought I wasn't supposed to feel as a man. And when I was 18, she did die, and 2 days later, I chose to catch up with a drug dealer. And what I didn't realise when I chose to catch up with them was that they had an aggressive interest in adolescent boys and sex acts. And what they didn't realise when they chose to catch up with me was that I was someone who'd spent my whole life fighting, and I was someone who was emotionally in a really volatile space. Looking back on it now, I recognise I was depressed, but I never would have seen it that way at the time, because I would have thought depression was about being sad. But does anyone know what's actually the most common emotion you see in adolescent males who are depressed? Yeah, anger, rage, you know, aggressive behaviour. And it's because of an inability to really sort of identify and deal with the emotions that make you feel vulnerable is often displaced and externalized in a more empowering way through anger. In fact, anger is a really common emotion to see in adults of either gender who have depression. Anyway, what neither of us realised when we made our respective choices that day was exactly where they would lead us. Before that day was out, he would be dead, and I'd be spending the first night of what would be the next 10 years plus behind bars. Now, I just want to be really clear at this point. I went to prison, and I went to prison for that long because I chose to go significantly beyond what was required of me in terms of self-defence. I wasn't a victim of the justice system in that sense. You know, I made those choices and they put me where they put me for that period of time. And I remember my first night in prison. So have any of you operated as criminal lawyers before? Okay, some of you have, so some of you might have some familiarity around how this all works. But what happens is, if you go to court and you're not going to be given bail to await trial, you're going to get remanded in custody, what they do is they keep you in the cells in the basement of the courthouse to the end of the day so they can do a single transportation to the prison. And that just stops them having to drop people off piecemeal. And by the time you get to the prison, everyone else is already locked up, because in medium to high security prisons in New Zealand and I imagine elsewhere, the end of the day is about 4:30. That's when you get your last meal when you're locked up for the night. And I remember arriving at the prison that night with everyone else who'd been remanded in custody that day. And I went to Mount Crawford, which is Wellington's main prison, or it used to be before it was retired. And it's an old British-style prison. And what that means is, instead of having bars on the front of the cells like you see on North American TV, or that you'd see in, say, Clarity2016, which is New Zealand's toughest maximum security prison, instead of that, it has big steel doors. And in the middle of those doors, it has peepholes, otherwise known as Judas holes. And those are for the guards to go around and periodically check you to make sure you haven't escaped, you haven't killed yourself, you haven't been killed by your cellmate, that type of stuff. And I remember walking down this wing for the first time with everyone else remanded in custody, and all you saw on either side were these eyes looking out of the cells at you. And people kick these big steel doors, and some people yell out, "Kill yourself! Hang yourself! I'll see you tomorrow." Now, I didn't see it this way at the time, but this was going to be an awesome personal development opportunity for me. You know, these days, as part of my professional backgrounds in leadership development, and I spend a lot of time with organisations working around culture change. I'm sure some of us have come across this sort of stuff before. But I'll tell you what, in terms of a baseline of a toxic culture, nothing competes with the prison environment. And I think one of the big ironies for me is that it wasn't until I was physically locked up that I realised I'd actually been imprisoned for a long time before I was physically incarcerated. I'd been imprisoned and held back because of my beliefs and ideas about the world, about who I was supposed to be, about how I was supposed to behave, and a real lack of clarity around what my purpose was, about what my values were, and what was important to me as a human being. Those things had held me back long before I was physically incarcerated. And it's ironic that it wasn't until I was in prison that I was able to start to unpack that and to break free of that personal prison, to break free of that mental prison. And I was able to do so through 5 progressive steps to personal change I call the 5 steps to freedom. And again, these days I specialise in terms of other people's behaviour, clarity and purpose, you know, being more consistently the person you want to be, that best version of yourself. And what I'll talk to you about with these 5 steps are universals that apply for all of us, but I'm going to illustrate them through my own story. So the first step is recognising that we're born free. As newborn babes, we're born with a clean slate. But what happens is, over time, in an attempt to make sense of our experiences and understand our place in the world, we develop these self-defeating and distorted beliefs that hold us back. You know, the most meaningful thing I've ever done in my life is become a father, and I've got a 2-year-old at the moment. And it is just so awesome to watch the level of authenticity there. If he feels like dancing, he dances. He doesn't not dance because he's worried about what people might think of him or anything like that. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some issues around the authenticity of 2-year-olds as well. But, you know, it is an opportunity to really see us before we start getting contaminated with those social ideas and expectations that we do develop over time. And for me, to challenge my own idea about my own beliefs and my own freedom, it actually took a meeting with one of New Zealand's most accomplished safecrackers. Now, I always knew I might end up in Clarity2016, which is, again, New Zealand's toughest maxi. And the reason I knew that is that, you know, I went to prison in a large part because I was making bad choices, because I lacked direction and I was getting involved in drugs, and they put me into high-risk situations. You know, I wasn't coping with my life. I didn't then end up in prison and go, okay, now that life's even worse, I'll stop doing drugs. The complete opposite. I went, I'm going to do anything I can get my hands on. You know, as a strategy to avoid coping with the reality of my situation or having to deal with the reality of my situation, I did anything I could get my hands on. And it was effective. You know, it helped me escape reality. But it wasn't a strategy supported by the prison administration. As a consequence of this, I spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, which is a whole other talk. It's a really interesting experience. But what it meant is I knew I'd probably end up in Maxi as soon as I turned 20, which is the earliest they would send you up there. And as people, we have a natural tendency to feel anxiety when there's uncertainty, when we can't predict the future. So I used to always ask people, what happens when you go to Maxi? And I'd be told, well, first of all, you'll go to a classification block for 3 months, and there you'll be observed to determine your propensity for violence. You'll have your record examined for gang associations, mental health issues, that type of stuff. And I was told then I would be moved to C block, and that would definitely be where I'd want to go, because that was the neutral block for non-gang members. And I was told under no circumstances would I want to end up in B block, because that's the most violent gang block. That's where all the riots and all the stabbings and those sorts of things happen. So I arrived up in Parry, and I was told C block and classification were both full, and I was going straight to B block. And if I thought Mount Crawford was an opportunity for personal growth and development, you know, this was another thing entirely. So it was a pretty scary environment for me. I remember, for example, being attacked in the yard with weight bars by one of the gangs, and I remember I used to go down to the dining room to get my meals. It was 3-story blocks there, and I was in the top story, and I'd go down to the dining room, and I would see tables of these gang members, and I would see them sitting there, and I'd see them talking to each other and looking at me and talking to each other, and I'd just be like, oh. And I used to just wait to get attacked all the time. And it was a place where I learned really important skills like how to make a weapon out of Glad wrap and a toothbrush. And that if I needed to use the toilet during the day, I better take one of my legs out of my pants if I needed to sit down. And that's so I could stand up and fight if I was attacked while I was on the toilet, because that's where people attempt to attack you when you're at your most vulnerable. But there were some bright spots as well about being in Parry. You know, people often talk about prison being like the university of crime, right? Has everyone heard that analogy? Well, where I started out, Mount Crawford, that was like doing an undergraduate in criminality. So, you know, you'd sit around and talk about how to steal cars and this sort of level of crime. And then Parry was very much like graduate school. To get in, you had to qualify, normally by getting kicked out of another prison, right? That's kind of like a B average minimum. Then, once you were there, you were surrounded by people who were really committed to their lifestyle choices, you know, really serious about whatever their focus was. Not only that, but you got a fine education in things like how to defeat alarm systems, hide from heat sensors and police helicopters, the kind of education you'd hope your tax dollars go on, right? But I used to spend a lot of time in the yard there with this guy who was a safecracker, and he was a very smart guy. He was a Mensa member. Is everyone here familiar with Mensa? Yeah, so for those of you who haven't heard of it, which is probably no one in this group to be honest, you know, it's a club for people with a significantly above average IQ. Now, I'm pretty sure he wasn't on any of their promotional materials or anything, but he was smart enough to be a member. And I remember coming out into the yard one time after he had been talking to me a bit about other stuff, but I came out the yard, it was after another period of solitary confinement, and he had 2 objects of unequal weight. And I'm going to demonstrate these, appropriately enough today, with a book, right? Tolstoy's War and Peace, and a piece of paper. And he said to me, if I drop these at the same time, which will hit the ground first? And I thought this was the most ridiculous question I'd ever been asked. Obviously the heavier thing would hit the ground first. It's heavier. And I'll tell you what, I would have bet every cent I could lay my hands on that being the case. In fact, hell, I would have bet every chicken dinner for a month. Chicken dinners are really valuable in prison, right? I was that certain. They hit the ground at the same time, right? Because that's how gravity works. But I kid you not when I tell you that was like a magic trick to me. In fact, I had to go myself a few times, got him to do it again in case it was some kind of trick. But this was the first time I'd been confronted with the idea that my thoughts and beliefs about the world could be really wrong. And not just in some kind of opinion way, but in a really tangible, observable fact kind of way about the world. That there wasn't a strong correlation between my confidence in the accuracy of my beliefs and their actual accuracy. Not only that, but it really changed my concept about what knowing stuff was about, what education was about. Before this, I thought, oh, education, that's something you did to get a job. And I never felt any kind of connection with education. You know, I'd been held back a year at school. I'd been very good at lunchtime and playtime, but that was about all I connected with. And I think part of that was because I thought that, you know, if you're smart, if you're intelligent, then this stuff would all come easy to you and you don't have to work hard for it. But I didn't find it easy, so therefore I can't be a smart person. So I didn't feel any connection with that, and I thought education is for getting a job. Now I realised education is something that you could do to increase your accuracy of your beliefs and enrich your experience of the world. You know, the root word for educate, the original Greek word, is to lead out of. It means to lead out of. And that's what it started to do for me. This is where I started to get the clarity of what my purpose was through being led out of the darkness of my own ignorance. So the first thing I started doing is I started reading. And my favourite author at this point became a guy called Solzhenitsyn. And he wrote a collection of books on prison in Stalinist Russia. And I'll tell you what, this taught me a very valuable psychological insight. When we're in situations where there's things that are causing us stress that are outside of our control, what we often do is we wish and we think about how much better things could be for us. We compare up. We go, oh, if only this was the case. You know, if only this was happening, you know, things would be so much better. But actually, if you want to be as resilient as possible, to be able to cope with your situation and make good choices that are effective for you, and the stresses you're encountering are outside of your control, you're way better off comparing down. You're way better off going, well, how much worse could things be? So I was in a bad situation, but I'll tell you what, reading about Russian prisons made me feel a whole lot more grateful about what my situation was. And it also led me to think, you know, I'd like to study something more formally, so I thought I'll study psychology. Because understanding what makes people tick would be a really useful skill to have. And I started studying psychology. I did 2 papers through Massey University, and the only reason I did it through Massey was because they were the only people who offered psychology at a distance. I didn't think I could study at a university level. I didn't start doing those papers with the intention of doing a degree at all. I would have thought that was way beyond my capability. But I'll tell you what happened. I started these papers and I passed them. Now, C's get degrees, right? Now, it wasn't like I got A's or anything, but I passed these papers. And I'll tell you what, that was such a process for me getting to that point. To give you an idea about how ignorant I was, the first assignment I wrote, it was a lab report for psychology, and I didn't understand what a paragraph was or really how a sentence worked or anything like that. So I wrote the whole thing as a single block of text, and I wrote it all in capital letters because I thought capitals looked neater. It's funny, I reflect on it now and I think of all the great feedback that I was given outside of the content, but just in terms of some basic, you know, English language skills. And I was referred to some good books in terms of some basic English language skills and understanding. And I remember thinking how generous that was. And now I sort of think about it with them getting this assignment with the prison stamp on it and then this shouting essay, right? And thinking, okay, I might give this one a little bit more attention. But you know, that first year of study, it taught me a really valuable lesson which really conflicted with what I'd previously thought. I had previously thought that if you were smart, then studying that would come easy to you. But what I actually learned through the process of that year is that your intellect is like your physical fitness. If you're not exercising it, you're not going to be anywhere near your potential. And through that first year of study, I started to get a base level of intellectual fitness. I started learning stuff that was really valuable for me. And it just completely changed my concept of the world and opened my eyes. You know, one of the things I started studying not too far into it as well was philosophy. Because philosophy is great stuff to be studying when you're in prison, because you're in prison because you've made decisions which are not considered to be socially appropriate, right? And if you really want to feel certain in the accuracy of your choices, then philosophy is a great subject in terms of giving you the skills to be able to address that or to challenge that. And one of the most powerful things, one of the most powerful quotes I came across in philosophy, which so resonated with me based on that limited amount of learning I'd had to that point, and which so resonates with me in terms of being here today, was Wittgenstein's quote that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. You know, I had been so ignorant up until that point that my world was such a small place. But what I found is through the process of starting to study, my world started to open up. It started to grow and increase. And through that, I decided that I wanted to try and do something different with my life. I decided not only, was I born free and it's the stuff that goes on here that's the issue for me, but I want to actually break out of that. I want to break out of that mental prison. And I'll tell you what, to be motivated to do that, I had to take a good, long, hard look at myself and say, what's my purpose? I had to get some clarity around that. Because what happens is, if you don't have clarity of purpose in your personal lives, when I say that, in terms of who you are as a human being, then it's really easy to make decisions on a moment-by-moment basis based on trying to avoid discomfort. Sarah was talking before about conflict, right? I mean, who really wants to engage in conflict? Unless you have clarity of purpose and you understand that conflict is the way to live in line with that purpose, right? So that's what it started to change for me. And at that point, I had lots of examples around me of what my future could look like, what my life could look like if I stayed on that track. And I chose to try and do something different. But it's one thing to have a dream, and it's another thing to actually turn that dream into a reality. So lots of people in prison go, oh, when I get free, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, when circumstances are better. But a real key for me is I didn't wait for circumstances to be better. I said to myself, what can I do right now? What small steps can I start taking today that are going to move me in the direction I want to travel? So, have any of you heard of the boxer Evander Holyfield, actually? This is the guy who had his ears bitten by Mike Tyson, for those of you who don't follow boxing. The poor guy, he's such a great boxer, and that's what he'll best be remembered for, I think. First time he set foot in a boxing gym was when he was 16 years old. And his raw talent was so obvious that the head trainer said to him, you could be the next Muhammad Ali. And he said, oh, that sounds good. And the head trainer said to him, now is that a dream or is that a goal? Because a dream is something you fantasize about. It's something you think, well, that'll be good. I'll get on to that next week, next month, next year. Whereas a goal is something where you develop real clarity of purpose and clarity around what small steps you need to take to move you from where you are to where you want to be. And it's something you put in place now. It's something you put in place today. So is that a goal or is that a dream? And 16-year-old Evander Holyfield said, I'll have to ask my mum. I kid you not, true story. He went on to become the undisputed cruiserweight champion, then heavyweight champion of the world. He went home that night, asked his mum, came back the next day. It was a goal. Right? But that's the thing. In terms of that clarity of purpose, it's not enough to have that idea. You have to have clarity around the small daily disciplines you can start taking, you can start instituting in your life. And that was something that was crucial for me in terms of my eventual success, but I also needed to be prepared to fight for that. It wasn't easy. The prison environment wasn't set up for studying. No one was studying at that point when I was there. So I spent the first 8 months going around asking people for permission to study, and I was in everyone's too hard basket. So I'd be told, oh no, you need to see that person, and they'd say, no, you need to see the person you just saw. So I asked my dad, remember Dad didn't give me that many cuddles? I said to him, look, can you just enroll me through Massey? Because what will happen is whoever's in the receiving office will get the material and go, oh, he must have permission for this, and let it through. And I kid you not, that's exactly how I went about that. But prison provided an opportunity to teach me lots about, doing really meaningful things for yourself, really living in line with your purpose. It's not about that being easy. And it's not about that not having obstacles or challenges, but it's about being able to see those as opportunities to sharpen your problem-solving skills, to build your resilience, to find workarounds. And if it was really worthwhile, we would all just be the best versions of ourselves all the time, right? But one thing it also taught me, and this relates to Dad as well, is that, the fight's best won are those with allies, are those which do use support. If I didn't have the support of Massey University, I never would have been able to study in the way I did. They let me do my whole master's degree from a distance. They let me do every single paper for it as a special topic paper, as long as each lecturer agreed to take me on in addition to their normal workload, and they did. Not only that, but when I finished my master's and I thought, well, a doctorate's the next logical step, right? They said there's no way you can start a doctorate without face-to-face meetings with your supervisors. My supervisors travelled hours out of their way to visit me in the prison for those meetings. Talk about going beyond the remit of your role, right? Think about that in their own time. In fact, one of them didn't even drive. So he would catch the train, walk for half an hour from the train station to the prison, have that meeting in the prison where you're treated with suspicion, you go through all of that process to visit people, and then come back. Absolutely amazing. And remember, Dad didn't give me that many cuddles. My dad visited me every weekend for over 10 years. I want you to think about how much value you place on your weekends, right? And giving up one of those days to go into an environment which is really hostile to you, which is really unpleasant. And it's only now that I'm a dad that I even recognise how incredibly hard that must have been. When I was 18 and I was on non-contact booth visits because of being high security, and Dad would come and visit me, and I'd often have black eyes or a broken nose, stuff like this from getting attacked or fighting, and he would have to walk away knowing there was nothing he could do to make me safe or improve my life, right? I'll tell you what, Dad may not have given me that many cuddles, but if I become even a pale reflection of the father he was for me, for my son, in terms of that support, my son will be a very lucky kid. You know? Dad is still such a man of his generation because I like to, hassle him a bit, and I'm a bit needy. I said to him the other day, oh, did I say that? I just meant to think that. But anyway, I said to him the other day, I said, look, Dad, are you proud of me? And he said, mostly. And I said to him, what, like 80-20? And he said, more like 60-40. But I always think one of the biggest indicators for success for me in my life now is I'm not the son that my dad worries about. It's my 36-year-old brother who's moved home to save, right? Anyway, the final step in terms of, the real importance for me in terms of having clarity of purpose around who I want to be and what that looks like is the step around living free. And this requires us to really keep it real about being the best versions of ourselves, being able to really champion what it is we believe in. And that requires energy. How many of you think that you're probably going to walk away from this conference and go, okay, went to the conference in 2016, self-actualized, tick. That's done now. It's not being the best version of yourself. It's like character fitness. It requires ongoing effort. Have any of you exercised and gotten fitter before? Yeah. Okay, have any of you exercised, gotten fitter, stopped exercising and found you stayed fit? No, that's not the way it works, right? It requires real effort. And you need energy for that. So look, just a quick question. How heavy do you think this glass of water is?
How long am I holding it?
Oh, Mensa members in the room. Did anyone hear that? Can you repeat that, please?
How long am I holding it?
Right, it's a trick question. This is how I entertain myself, is via trick questions. What I was hoping for, and if you had been a group of engineers, I would have got this, 200 grams. No, 220 grams. This kind of stuff. In terms of how heavy it is, what's really most important for me is not the absolute weight, but how long I've been holding it. And this is what prolonged stress and pressure is like. If you've been experiencing stress and pressure for a little while, like I've been holding this for a little while, it's not too heavy. I've still got energy to be the best version of myself to do everything else I want to do. But if I've been under prolonged stress and pressure, if I've been holding this for a day or a week, I don't have any energy for anything else. It becomes crippling for me. Have any of you noticed when you're really under the pump, when you're under prolonged stress and pressure, that some of the politeness slips from your personal relationships? That you just don't have the energy to be that tolerant, compassionate person you'd most like to show up as? So one of the things that's crucial for me in terms of really being able to do what I believe in and champion that is having the energy to try and be the best version of myself. And that requires me having strategies in place to put that glass down so that when I pick it back up again, it's not too heavy. So what are those strategies? Well, it's anything that gets you present, that gets you in the moment, that stops you thinking about yesterday or tomorrow, gets you out of your head. So there's been a lot of work done by a coaching psychology guru out of Australia around this, a guy called Andrew May. And look, it looks different ways for different people. For a lot of people it's sport or exercise. For some people it's cooking or gardening, spending time with your kids when you're not on your phone, that kind of stuff. But he's also found getting into nature regularly is excellent for this. Having a massage, having sex. Now he hasn't done the follow-up research yet, but I reckon if you're having sex when you're in nature, extra points, right? But the irony is what we do is we deprioritize this stuff as we get busy. So that's been a crucial thing for me, and what I'd recommend for you as well. You have to be as disciplined and as consistent about that, putting the glass down, as anything else that's important to you. Particularly if it comes to really champion causes which do make you a little bit uncomfortable, do get you out of your comfort zone. So, just to recap, for me the most important thing was recognizing that the issues that I needed to deal with, the things that I needed to do, were the things that related to what was going on in here, not actually the world out there. The second step was choosing to do something about that, choosing to risk failure, to be able to get out of my comfort zone. And think about this, when you're out of your comfort zone, that's when the magic happens, right? That's when you grow. But by definition, being out of your comfort zone is not where you're comfortable. So one of the things that was important for me is changing my perception around my emotions from I shouldn't feel emotions that make me uncomfortable to that's how I know that I'm growing. That's how I know that I'm putting myself into situations where I'm doing what's right rather than what's easy. The third step was actually turning that dream into a goal. Getting clarity around what are the small steps I can start taking on a daily basis that will move me the distance that I want to go. And the fourth, being prepared to fight for that. Recognizing that obstacles are opportunities. They're not things that, derail us or can't be overcome. And the fifth was keeping it real about what it means to live free. And look, Sarah, I so love that. When you were talking about progress, not perfection, I cannot tell you how many times a week I say that to people. Focus on getting better, not being good. And I can't think of a group that's more likely to have perfectionist tendencies than a group of lawyers. Right? So this is a particular group where that message needs to be so strong. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. I regularly fail to be the best version of myself possible, regularly. But I don't use that as an excuse to give up on it. I use that as an opportunity to learn and grow. And that's the whole point of life's journey, right? No one's at the top of their mountain. So the question I leave you with is, what's your prison? What's the opportunity for you to use greater clarity around what your purpose is, what your values are, what your challenges are to really break free and be the best version of yourself possible? So thank you.